Okay, picture a war, fought not with tanks or battleships, but in total, dead silence. A conflict that's waged in a dimension you can't even see, where victory isn't measured in territory, but in radio waves and phantom echoes. Now, this isn't science fiction. This is the honest-to-God story of how the most advanced air defense system the world had ever seen was brought to its knees, not by some superweapon, but by something you could literally hold in your hand. So let's dive in, because this story, it reveals how a battle for the electromagnetic spectrum that started 80 years ago is still shaping the technology and conflicts that define our world today.
To really get the scale of what happened, you have to understand the absolute, rock-solid confidence of the German war machine. Just listen to those words from Feldwebel Ernst Simon. This wasn't just arrogance, it was a belief that was forged in years of being technologically superior. German radar operators like him, they felt like gods, peering into the pitch-black night and just plucking enemy bombers out of the sky with these invisible electronic hands. To them, their technology wasn't just good, it was perfect. It was a symbol of German engineering, a huge source of pride, and the very bedrock of their fortress. They truly believed they were untouchable. And that belief? It was about to be shattered in the most spectacular way you can imagine.
So what was this fortress they were so confident in? Well, it was called the Kammhuber Line, a name that struck absolute fear into the hearts of Allied aircrews. This thing was an electronic wall, an invisible spider's web of radar beams stretching all the way from the fjords of Norway down to the coast of France, and it was designed with one single purpose: to make flying a bomber over Germany at night an act of suicide.
Now, this is where you see the real genius of the system. It wasn't just one type of radar. It was like a symphony of destruction. First, you had the long-range Freya radars. They'd pick up the bomber formations gathering over England, sometimes more than 120 kilometers away. Then, as the bombers got closer, they were handed off to a series of these interlocking cells. And inside each cell was a super-precise Würzburg radar that could lock onto a single bomber and feed its exact position, range, altitude, everything, to a dedicated night fighter circling right nearby. It completely changed the game. It turned the chaotic guesswork of night fighting into a cold, calculated, almost scientific interception. The German pilots weren't just hunting in the dark. They were being guided like a surgeon's scalpel.
And this was the brutal result of all that precision, 5.2%. Now, that might not sound like a huge number to you, but let me put it in perspective. In military terms, a 5% loss rate is considered unsustainable. It means that after just 20 missions, statistically, your entire force is wiped out. And these weren't just machines. Every single one of those bombers had 7, 8, sometimes 10 highly trained men on board. This number represents a horrifying bleed of lives and equipment that the Allies just could not afford. The Kammhuber Line was working. It was chewing up the Royal Air Force, one bomber at a time.
And for the Americans, who were flying their missions in broad daylight, the cost was even more horrific. I mean, on the infamous raid against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 bombers out of 376. That's a 16% loss rate in a single day. A whole generation of American airmen was facing the very real possibility of not coming home. These losses were so catastrophic, they almost broke the back of the entire American strategic bombing effort. It forced them to question everything they believed in. This invisible fortress was all too real, and it was bleeding the Allies dry.
This quote from the head of RAF Bomber Command, Arthur Bomber Harris, it just lays the grim reality bare, doesn't it? It's a chilling calculation of blood and steel. The Allies were locked in a war of attrition they were going to lose. It didn't matter how many bombers they built. They were losing trained, experienced crews way faster than they could replace them. They were facing a strategic dead end. They had to find a way to break through that invisible fortress, or the entire air war against Germany was going to fail. They needed something new, a new idea, something the Germans would never, ever see coming.
And the solution, when it finally came, wasn't some complex new death ray or a super bomber. No, it was something so brilliantly simple, so elegantly low-tech that it was almost absurd. This is a true David versus Goliath story, where the key to defeating a multi-million Reichsmark high-tech fortress was found not in some fancy lab, but in a place you would absolutely least expect.
This. Aluminum foil. The British called it window. A brilliant young Welsh physicist named Joan Curran and her team figured out that if you cut strips of aluminum foil to a very specific length, exactly half the wavelength of that German Würzburg radar, each tiny little strip would resonate and reflect the radar signal with incredible efficiency. In fact, a single bundle of these strips would just blossom on a radar screen with an echo as big as a 4-engine heavy bomber. The idea was just breathtakingly simple. Drop thousands of these bundles, and you could create a phantom air force, a complete blizzard of false targets that would totally overwhelm the German radar operators.
And this is where the sheer brilliance of the whole thing becomes crystal clear. On one side, you've got the German Würzburg radar. It's a marvel of engineering, right? An 8-meter dish, precision bearings, cutting-edge tech, taking over 3,000 hours of skilled labor to build. And on the other side, you have a 27-centimeter strip of aluminum foil glued to paper that cost a fraction of a penny. It was the ultimate asymmetric weapon. But there was a problem, a huge one, that kept this revolutionary idea locked away on a shelf for over a year.
This was the catch. British intelligence knew that German scientists had actually developed the exact same technology on their own. They called it Duple. So both sides had this key to unlock the other's fortress, but they were absolutely terrified to use it. Linderman's warning haunted the British War Cabinet. They remembered the Blitz, the nightly bombing of London. If they used Window to blind German radar, the Germans would for sure use Duple against them in a new bombing campaign. It was this terrifying game of chicken, where the first one to blink could unleash a whole new wave of destruction on their own people. For 13 long months, this war-winning technology just sat there, locked in a stalemate of fear.
But by July of 1943, the math had changed. Allied losses were just too high, and the German bomber force had been gutted on the Eastern Front. The risk was finally worth the reward. The target was Hamburg, and the mission was codenamed Operation Gomorrah. This was the night the stalemate would finally be broken. This was the night the Allies would unleash their secret weapon. For the German radar operators all across Northern Europe, it started just like any other night, but it would end as the night their entire world came crashing down around them. This was the night radar died.
Let's try to experience this through the eyes of Oberfeldwebel Klaus Hartman, a radar operator at a station outside Hamburg. At 10:30 p.m., everything is normal. He sees the bomber formations gathering. Standard procedure. At midnight, they cross the coast. And then, at 1 minute past midnight, his world just violates every single principle of physics he's ever learned. His radar screen, which normally shows these crisp individual little dots, it doesn't just show more targets, it explodes. It becomes a solid, glowing mass. Hundreds, maybe thousands of returns, spreading across his screen like a virus. In his logbook, he actually scribbled, "This cannot be real." His training told him it had to be an equipment failure, but his gut told him he was witnessing a brand new form of warfare.
And that feeling of absolute chaos just rippled through the entire network. Can you imagine being a fighter controller? Your whole job is to guide your pilots to the kill, you're listening to Hartman's reports, you're looking at your own plotting table, and it shows an armada bigger than the entire Royal Air Force bearing down on you. You try to guide a night fighter to a target, but the target just dissolves into 10 others. You hear the frantic reports coming over the radio. There are bombers everywhere. It is impossible to direct fighters. The system, their perfect, flawless system, wasn't just struggling. It was paralyzed. It was completely blind, deaf, and dumb.
So, what was the result for the 791 Allied bombers flying through this electronic storm? Well, they flew to Hamburg almost completely untouched. Searchlights were just sweeping aimlessly across the sky. The anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and basically unaimed. Night fighters, like the one flown by the ace Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, found their radars totally overwhelmed, seeing ghosts everywhere but unable to lock on to a single real target. Only 12 planes were lost that night. The loss rate had plummeted from that soul-crushing 5% to a miraculous 1.5%. The penny's worth of chaos had worked beyond anyone's wildest dreams.
So the crucial point is right here, in Hartman's own words. This wasn't just a tactical defeat for one night. This was a profound psychological shock. The entire foundation of their technological superiority had just crumbled in a matter of minutes. That feeling of being invincible was replaced by this terrifying sense of vulnerability. We had become useless overnight. Can you even imagine that feeling? To go from being the all-seeing eye in the sky to being utterly blind, your skills and your expensive equipment rendered completely worthless by something you couldn't even begin to comprehend? The war in the air had fundamentally changed forever.
But the war was far from over. In fact, that night in July 1943 kicked off one of the most frantic and fascinating technological arms races in all of history. The Germans were down, but they were a long, long way from out. The Invisible War now became this relentless technological seesaw, a desperate struggle between jamming and counter-jamming, between detection and deception, that pushed the absolute boundaries of science and engineering.
Just look at the German response. Before Window, they had precision radar-guided interception. It was a science.
After Window, they were forced into this tactic called Ville de Sow, or wild boar. They were literally sending up single-seat day fighters whose pilots had little to no night-flying training and telling them to just fly towards the burning cities and try to spot bombers visually, silhouetted against the fires. It was a massive shift from high-tech superiority to a desperate, almost medieval kind of improvisation. It was a clear sign that their technological edge had just vanished.
And while the Germans were trying to improvise, the Allies were innovating. See, Window was passive. It just reflected signals. The next step was active jamming. The Americans developed a device called Carpet. It didn't just create false targets, it actually listened for German gun-laying radars and then blasted a powerful stream of electronic noise right back at them on their exact frequency, totally blinding them. And the effect was devastating. Just look at the drop in losses to flak, or anti-aircraft fire, from 2.5% all the way down to 0.4%. That's a staggering 75% reduction in effectiveness. For thousands of airmen, this wasn't just some abstract chart. It was literally the difference between life and death.
Now, the Germans fought back, of course. They developed new radars on new frequencies, like the SN2, which could actually see through the original Window. And for a few months, their night fighter aces were back in business. But the seesaw tipped decisively in the Allies' favor thanks to a stroke of luck and some brilliant intelligence work. In July 1944, a German night fighter pilot got lost in the fog and accidentally landed his top-secret plane, complete with the latest SN2 radar, at an RAF base in England. It was an intelligence jackpot. British scientists took it apart, figured out every last detail, and within weeks, they had developed a specific jammer to defeat it. Germany just couldn't keep up. The Allied combination of better intelligence, scientific research, and massive industrial power meant they would always be one step ahead.
So, why does this story from 80 years ago still matter so much? Why have we spent all this time dissecting this invisible battle? Because the events we've just talked about didn't just end in 1945. They created this profound legacy that directly echoes in our hyper-connected, technology-driven world today. The Invisible War never really ended. It just evolved. And the real question we have to ask ourselves is, are we ready for the next chapter? That night over Hamburg was literally the birth of modern electronic warfare. It proved that controlling the electromagnetic spectrum was just as critical as controlling the land, the sea, or the air. It kicked off this endless race between detection and deception that still defines military technology to this day. I mean, the principles of confusing radar are the direct ancestors of today's stealth aircraft. The need to navigate through jammed areas helped spur the development of the GPS that's in your phone right now. And the impact on Germany was catastrophic. It forced them to divert almost 90% of their top electronics experts into this desperate losing battle, starving other critical programs of vital brainpower.
But beyond all the technology, beyond the strategy, this is the number that truly matters: 4,500. That's the conservative estimate of how many American airmen's lives were saved by radar countermeasures alone. That's 4,500 sons, brothers, and fathers who came home because a team of scientists figured out how to make simple strips of foil shout louder than a bomber. It's just a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with courage alone, but with pure ingenuity.
And that brings us right to today. We live in a world that is completely, utterly dependent on that invisible electromagnetic spectrum. Our communications, our banking, our navigation, our power grids, all of it relies on signals that we can't see. And so I'll leave you with this question. When we think about conflict today, we often think of traditional weapons. But looking back at the lessons of 1943, is it possible that the next great war, the one that could truly paralyze our society, is already being fought in that exact same invisible dimension, in a battle we cannot see?